Good morning or afternoon or evening, and welcome. It is the Debates About the Environment edition of AP World History. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, this is the learning objective associated with topic 9.3. It is explain the causes and effects of environmental changes in the period from 1900 to the present. And then basically, right? Since it's asking us for causes and effects, let's look at what the actual unit guide itself has to say from the College Board. They say, as human activity contributed to deforestation, kind of one, desertification, two, a decline in air quality, three, an increased consumption of the world's supply of fresh water, oops, that's four, the result, kind of, right? So causes. The result is humans competing over these and other resources, right? So that is definitely an effect. So we're going to talk a little bit about human competition over resources, but first I want to talk about kind of some background to these things. So if we look at these two charts, they are of CO2 emissions in billions of tons. And this first one, graph one, is the total carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see that it has this pretty steady increase from the year 1960 onward with kind of little dips, but a general growth, right? From 10 billion tons of CO2 to 35 in, what is this, 40, 56 years. If we look down here at graph two, the share of those global carbon dioxide emissions, right? We can see the percent. When we start in 1960, so same year as up here, we see that the two big producers are Europe and the United States. They are the two most industrialized countries in 1960. They are the first world during the Cold War, and we can see that they dominate, like, dramatically, the carbon dioxide emissions. As time goes by, we see a steady decrease in the share of global carbon dioxide emissions particularly after 1970 when the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is created, the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts, all of these things kind of pushed through by President Nixon. These we start to see kind of some improvements. And then as the European Union also continues to regulate carbon emissions, and we start to see also a big thing, the deindustrialization. Let me make sure that this doesn't change. Deindustrialization. The big factories after 1970, for the most part, are not in the United States and Europe. It is too expensive to employ American and European workers. So we see a lot of the carbon emitting industries moving from the global north to the global south. So let's look at what happens as the years go by. So we'll look at China, right, which is this one. We see China take this big plunge. Interestingly enough, kind of after the Great Leap Forward and during the Cultural Revolution, kind of bottoms out in the 60s. And then with the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, we see this start a steady increase, right, to a pretty dramatic increase between 2000 and 2010. That's the rapid industrialization of China, right? Those are all of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, all of his measures to increase the kind of self-interest of Chinese people, the growth of the middle class, the whole idea of made in China. All of that is happening. We see it here with carbon dioxide emissions. We look at Russia. Boop, 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 right? Still communist, 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 communist. Oh my gosh, not communist. A big drop, right? And we read about how this kind of fits into the context of after the Soviet Union's collapse, we see this huge economic collapse as well. So, right, the end of communism equaled economic collapse in the Soviet Union into the Russian Federation, and didn't do that in China, which is very interesting, right? And then it kind of levels out. We also see India, right? What we would consider to be a developing country. And it's going to start to make this climb. But you see that there's this big division between the global south and the global north. The people who did the colonizing versus the colonized for the most part, right? And what this is going to lead into is this lack of consensus between developing countries, countries that are in the midst of their industrial revolution, and those who had theirs 200 years ago. These countries are going to say, guys, we need to rein it in. We have to protect the environment. We need to clean up our factories. We need to clean up our water. We need to clean up our emissions. We need to have electric cars. And these guys are going to say, yeah, that's cool that you can say that. You can say that because you already destroyed your environment. You did it 200 years ago during your industrial revolution. And now that you are industrialized and that your economies are sound and productive and growing, now you can rein it in and you can afford to care about the environment. And they're like, we can't afford to care about the environment. That's not what we can do. So speaking of the Soviet Union, let's take a look at this quote real quick. I belong to those scientists who consider that the drying up of the Aral Sea is far more advantageous than preserving it. First, in its zone, good fertile land will be obtained. Cultivation of cotton alone will pay for the existing Aral Sea with all its fisheries, shipping, and other industries. Second, the disappearance of the sea will not affect the region's landscapes. So let's talk about a few things. One, Babayev, he's president of the Soviet Turkmenistan's Academy of Sciences. This is the late 1950s. So we know that elsewhere around the world, we kind of have the Green Revolution going on. We know that it is Soviet, it is Turkmenistan. So it is one of the kind of satellites of the USSR. He is president of the Academy of Sciences. So he has a very prominent role. And this is what he's saying, right? That cultivation of cotton will pay for the existing RLC. So, like, if the fisheries and everything kind of disappear, that's cool because they'll be able to cultivate cotton on all this good, fertile land. Also, the disappearance of the sea will not affect the region's landscapes. Oh. So let's look at what happens. So here's 1960. So he said that in the late 1950s. So here's 1960. Here's the RLC. It is the fourth largest body of inland water. 1973. Here's what's been lost. 1997. Here's what's been lost. 1999. Here's what's been lost. 2006, 2009, 2014. It's mostly gone. Right? So now there is a new international boundary between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where previously there was a big sea. Right? And he said it wouldn't alter the country's landscapes, will not affect the region's landscapes. Interesting. Now it's a desert, right? So this is what we call desertification, right? The making of deserts where there were not deserts before. The other item that we wanted to talk about was deforestation. So, right, global south, global north. So the places where we are experiencing the worst deforestation are the places that had the most catching up to do. The places that have the luxury of being able to replant their forests are the places that had already caught up, right? And this is just from 1990 to 2015. So in just 25 years, right? Particularly concerning, obviously, is the Amazon, right? The Indonesian rainforest, the Congo. Right? So the other piece of information, oh, wait, we have to talk about competition over resources. So, as the world population continues to grow, we see the world's resources continually coming under strain. We have new extractive technologies. We have increased consumer demand, right? Think about it. You probably hear this whenever we talk about the environment. Um, if everyone wants to live at the rate of an American, where you can drive everywhere, where you can just take showers multiple times a day, where the beef that you eat, the chicken that you eat, the all of that consumes so much resources. And if a billion people in China want to do that too, that really kind of ramps up the expectations that we're putting on our resources, including our land, our forests, our water sources, and the air. We continue to search for hydrocarbons, so oil essentially. And as the world's kind of easily accessible supplies become exhausted, the exploration for new sources of fuel push into challenging areas and most often fragile and weak states. Weak states where they're kind of ripe for civil war, where the kind of interest of corporations can sway the fledgling democracies slash dictatorships that develop in these places, and where sectarian violence is a huge risk. Most people consider the UN, the United Nations, as responsible for dealing with these types of resource disputes. However, you can imagine that an individual country would be very insulted by the idea that a huge governing body gets to make decisions over its resources and how it handles those resources. Furthermore, any kind of environmental crisis puts a huge strain on a government. So if there is a drought, and then that leads to a famine or what have you, certain members of the community can feel that their feelings of injustice can be exacerbated, and that can lead to revolt against a ruling party or the government. It can lead to civil war. Like we see that there was a severe drought in Syria before the outbreak of their civil war in 2011. We're going on, right, 9 years of civil war in Syria. It's hard to believe that that's gone on for as long. So that's in terms of competition over resources. That's what we're talking about. So the other aspect that the College Board wants us to talk about is the release of greenhouse gases and pollutants into the atmosphere, and how there have evolved debates about the nature and causes of climate change. So the first thing I want to talk about was the greenhouse effect itself, because when I was in elementary school, it was a big deal and we talked about it a lot, but we don't talk about it as much anymore. So the greenhouse effect is essentially, right, the sun puts out radiation. Most of that radiation, the violent, I guess not violent, the damaging aspects of it are bounced out. They're reflected by the earth, the water, and our atmosphere. Um, a lot of radiation is absorbed by the earth. It becomes warm. Um, the infrared radiation that is trapped, right, and especially if there are a lot of fluorocarbons um, in the atmosphere, it traps the radiation, so like it can't escape, and so it like makes a convection and causes global warming. That's the idea behind the greenhouse effect. So let's look. This is J.R. McNeill. So he's a historian. He is one of the authors of one of the big AP World History textbooks. He also does a lot of work on disease. So I've read one of his books on the impacts of the plague. He did work on the Columbian Exchange and the smallpox growth. His other kind of area of specialty is environmental history. So here's what he has to say. And this is 2000. So this is back when this idea of the greenhouse effect was very big, and the holes in the ozone layer and all of that. Quote, the health consequences of air pollution in the 20th century were gargantuan, although hard to measure precisely. Well, so then how do we know that they were gargantuan, right? So the fact that he says, although hard to measure precisely, already kind of causes us to be like, okay, well, there are some limitations to how we can measure this. Is it causation or is it correlation? By 1992, so that's 8 years before he is writing this book, according to one World Bank estimate, so we have this appeal to a higher authority. It is coming from the World Bank, one of our global institutions. It says air pollution in the world's cities killed 300,000 to 700,000 people a year, whereas car crashes kill about 880,000 people a year, which is just a tremendous amount. Wow. So almost as many people a year are killed by the effects of air pollution as are killed in car accidents. Now, in 1986, so this is 4 years later, The Harvard School of Public Health, so like that's kind of a big deal, put the figure at 568,000. So, right, kind of dead in the middle. In 1997, so a year later, the World Health Organization, so again, a world governing body, estimated that all air pollution killed 400,000 people in the world annually. Taking the lower figure, okay, so we're going to be kind of generous and take the lowest figure because, right, we can't measure this precisely. And assuming that A, at-risk urban populations quadrupled since 1950, so there are more people at risk since 1950, and B, the increasing lethality of air pollution in China, the Third World, and the Soviet bloc offset the air quality improvements in Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, I reckon that air pollution killed about 20 million to 30 million people between 1950 and 1997. That's a lot of people. Right, and so he's using this as evidence, the idea that at-risk urban populations have quadrupled. So there are more people living in cities exposed to bad air pollution. That there are more of these people living in awful air pollution places like China, the Third World, and the Soviet bloc. Okay. For the 20th century as a whole, the figure would be only a bit larger because urban populations were smaller in the first half of the century. Although in the Western world, air pollution was worse. So in Europe and the United States, air pollution was worse at the beginning of the 20th century, but then its population kind of shrunk and everyone else's population grew, and that's where the pollution got worse. All told, a guesstimate. Oh, a guesstimate. For air pollution's 20th century toll would be 25 million to 40 million, roughly the same as the combined casualties of the world wars, and similar to the global death toll from the 1918-1919 flu, the 20th century's worst encounter with infectious disease, right? So essentially that pollution equals a public health crisis, right? That there is a cost to pollution, and that cost is millions of people. That's what he's saying here. You can imagine that that's quite polarizing, and there have been huge debates that have grown up over both climate change and how to handle the environment. So there are basically two sides. There's the kind of non-human caused side, and then there's the human caused side. So this is the non-human caused side. So you can kind of see how people approach it. So this idea of a carbon tax, they want no carbon tax because that's the idea that government should tax large corporations based on how much carbon they emit. And that way it encourages corporations in order to be more eco-friendly. But they're saying that it would cost jobs, right? It would be expensive. It would cost jobs. Here they're saying CO2 is not a pollutant, right? CO2 is a naturally occurring chemical compound. We all exhale it. So there's that. And then this person I want to talk about, they talk about how there are fluctuations in the Earth's temperature. So we have recorded through ice cores, through documentary evidence where it exists, that the Earth's temperature fluctuates. It goes through phases. Fun fact, I also learned this in an archaeology class. Our pole also shifts. So like the North Pole, the magnetic field switches. Like what was the North Pole becomes the South Pole. Yeah, happens like every 100,000 years. Pretty crazy. And then there's another side, right? There is the pro that it is a human cause, and because it is human cause, there's something that we can do about it. So, as I was mentioning, right, we do have a variation in temperature over the years. So starting in 600, so we're going to call it collapse of Rome, talking in Europe, right? It is also the beginning of the Sui dynasty. They built the Grand Canal. To 2000, right, we see this light gray is kind of the big fluctuations, and then this is the average fluctuation. And you can see from like 1300-ish to 1800-ish, This is the Little Ice Age. And this is what's called the medieval warm period. So we see kind of this resurgence, and then we see, oh, so like sad face. We see industrialization. We also see throughout this course, we see multiple volcanic eruptions, like the type of volcanic eruptions where there are like the earth is cold for a year because so much dust is emitted by volcanoes that the sun doesn't come through. Yeah, bad times. Earlier this year, you might have noticed I read this book, Nature's Mutiny: How the Little Ice Age of the Long 17th Century Transformed the West and Shaped the Present. Right? This idea that the Little Ice Age is a real thing and that the Earth's temperature does fluctuate and that it had huge consequences. Um, the Enlightenment happens during this time period, which is very intriguing, right? This idea of people being forced to be inside because of the weather, and so they're forced to have deep, deep thoughts because they're not outside working in the fields. Also, this idea of, coupled with the plague, coupled with bad harvests, are we seeing a restriction on population growth that could also lead to huge expanses in trade and in the resources for those people who are around. Um, this has basically all resulted in a huge partisan divide over climate change, where you can see how, especially even as time goes by, if we think about it in 2001 during the presidency of George W. Bush, that people are much more closely, Americans are much more closely aligned on whether they're Democrats or Republicans as to the reality of climate change or global warming. And that, right, 10 years later, there's a huge divide, right? This idea of polarization as we've seen the parties grow apart. And it's very interesting as to why that is and what exactly has happened as time has gone by. So I did want to talk about this good site called procon.org. So it's a really, if you ever have to like do a research project, it's a great source to start from because they set the arguments of both sides against each other. So you can see kind of how, um, right, if we're looking at the argument of is human activity primarily responsible for global climate change, we have overwhelming scientific consensus finds humans activity primarily responsible versus many scientists disagree that human activity, right? So it kind of takes all of the emotion and takes the like politicization out of it and just gives you the arguments for, the arguments against, and they're all cited. So you can then scroll down to the bottom and get to the sources somewhere. So I wanted to give you that information before letting you go. And there we have it.